Hi class, in this video, we're going to go over chapter 19 in your textbook. So from this chapter on, we're looking at the economy on the bigger picture. That's why this chapter is called a Macroeconomic Perspective. And what you remember from the previous chapters, there are two types of economics. We have the microeconomics, which is spelled M-I-C-R-O. That's the economy on a smaller scale. So we look at the economy, individual consumer, individual business, and individual market. But for this macroeconomics, we look at the economy on the bigger picture here. So from this chapter on, we look at the economy in variables that's impacting the entire economy. So macro, the big picture, micro, the small picture. Okay, so let's get started. All right. So we're gonna talk about this overall economy, but first of all, let's talk about a little bit of history. So what you have learned in your U.S. history class. Now this picture here was shot during the Great Depression, so in the 1929, 1930s. And then one big characteristics of the Great Depression was that really the economy was slowing down so much that many family, many household doesn't have enough income anymore. They don't have jobs anymore. And because of this lack of income, the standard of living went down, that people couldn't afford to buy anything anymore, right? So this economic fluctuations definitely have an impact on people's standard of living, and that's why we really care about this macroeconomic measurement in the economy, because that really shows you how good, how bad the economy is. So this here shows you what is the plan for this chapter. So we look at the goal. So what is the goal for the macroeconomics? We're looking at, what are we trying to do? So for most economies in the world, we have three goals. So first is to ensure economic growth. Second, have low unemployment rate, and also have very low inflation. Now for our U.S. central bank, so the goal of the U.S. policymakers, this is also the same goal: economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. And also the framework. So what do we use to analyzing all the variables? We're going to look at stuff such as aggregate demand supply. So what is the difference between this and what you learned in chapter 3 is that the regular supply demand is only on the supply demand of individual market, individual goods and services. But for the aggregate supply demand, we're looking at the demand supply of everything in the economy. So later on, there will be a chapter dedicated for this topic. So for now, just know that the aggregate demand supply is the supply demand for everything. And also two models, the Keynesian model and a new classical model. Again, we're going to study more about this in the future chapters. And that's because, for economics, many things, there are so many variables involved. So economists using models to explain how the economy actually works. So the two most very well-known model we're going to hear a lot is called the Keynesian view and also neoclassical view. There's a chapter for each of those in the later part of the semester. And then next we'll look at the policies, right? So once we know how the economy works, once we know what the goal is, how do we make it to work? So what kind of policy can we use? So there are two different policies. So monetary policy, that's how our government uses money supply to influence the economy. And lastly, fiscal policy is how our government just using either spending or tax to influence our economy. So again, those will be coming up in later chapters. So one of the biggest definitions you need to learn for this chapter is called a gross domestic product, or also known as GDP. Now you hear this all the time. So economists using GDP to measure how big the economy is, or if the country is wealthy or not. So by definition, GDP doesn't measure how much money you have. GDP measures how much good and service the country can produce. So so when you see what the GDP is, it really shows you how big the economy is. The more good and service the country can produce, the bigger the economy is. And in US, we're number 1 in GDP. Number 2, you have China, and number 3, Japan. So those would be the biggest economies in the world. Now, for this GDP, there are two ways to measure our GDP. We can see how much is our total production of everything. So you can imagine you're going to survey all the companies, ask them about what is the value added in the production, how much extra stuff did they produce. Or we can approach this from the demand side. We can see how much is the total consumption, the total spending in the economy. Because your total spending in the economy, for everything you're spending money on, that also equal to how much good and service is being produced. Because for everything you sold, it's been purchased by somebody else. So to measure this GDP, we can just measure the 4 components of the spending in the economy. And they're consumption, investment, government spending, and also something called a net export. And even when you look at our US economy, so for US economy, consumption is the biggest component in our US economy. So typically, on annual basis, consumption is about maybe 70% of our overall economy. And then we have your government spending is about 18%. Now the thing with government spending, it is getting bigger and bigger as we go. So there are a couple reasons. So for one is that we are having more spending that's due to the result of Social Security, Medicare. So as the country getting older and older and older, we're spending more money by the government. So then the number is increasing. We also have investment, so that's the spending by all the business. And lastly, we have our net export. And net export, that's our trade with other countries. So that will be your export minus import, and that is our net export. And if you look at our growth of our consumption, so consumption has been growing a little bit, so pretty steadily if you compare to other variables, but consumption consistently has been above 60%, so it's close to 70% now. And then for the diagram on the right, when you look at our import-export, then it is following a trend that looks like they are increasing and decreasing at the same time, but the overall trend is that our import-export together is increasing as the time goes. So that really shows you something called a globalization, right? So as the economy growing in different countries, then more and more of the productions, either import or export, are now being integrated into different countries' production. Every more increasingly that we're buying more stuff from other countries, at the same time we're selling more stuff to other countries. So both import and export is increasing. All right, so also know something called a trade balance. So trade balance is the gap between your import-export. So trade balance equal to export minus import. Now if whenever your trade balance is positive, that's called a trade surplus. Whenever trade balance is negative, that's called a trade deficit. So for US, we have a trade deficit with many other countries. So for example, if you look at the trade between US and China, then US will have a lot more import from China than our export going to China. So US have a trade deficit with China, right? So again, if it's positive, it's called trade surplus. If it's a negative, called trade deficit. All right, so for our GDP, one more time. So GDP, if you look at the overall GDP, what does it equal to? Equals to your consumption plus investment plus government spending, and lastly plus net export, which is export minus import. All right, so the production for the country, so look at on the other side of the equation. So for all the productions, we can divide them into 5 categories. So they're divided into durable good. So anything lasts more than 3 years is a durable good. Non-durable good, so obviously anything lasts less than 3 years. So your groceries, most of your clothes, they last less than 3 years. That's a non-durable good. And then services, so going to movies, watching TV, getting a haircut, getting education, go to see a doctor, those are services. Structures, so buildings, factories that last a long time, those are houses, that's also part of the production. And lastly is change in inventory. So this change in inventory, this is special for many companies, because if a company are unable to sell everything they produced this year, then this extra stuff that's left over in our inventory will be able to help us sell more next year. So the change in inventory, the leftover inventory, is also part of our production. All right, so for US economy, the biggest component is our service industry. So we are a service dominant industry. And then for the manufacturers, has been getting smaller and smaller. So today, for our manufacturers, it's already about 30% of the overall economy. Now, that wasn't always the case, right? So if you look at our U.S. economy back in 1950s, the manufacturer was bigger than what is it now. So back in 1950s, our durable good was about 20% economy, so that's been pretty steadily. But our non-durable good was almost 30% economy, right? But as the time goes by, our non-durable good has been decreasing. So think about all your shirt, all your clothes you buy from all the stores. 40, 50 years ago, they were all made in America, and those were non-durable good. But today, if you buy a shirt, let's say from Abercrombie, from Gap, they're made in China, right? So those non-durable goods are now being imported from other countries. So we don't produce them anymore. That's why you see this non-durable good has been decreasing for the last 60-70 years. But for our services, has been increasing steadily, right? So US, we're now becoming a service industry, service economy. For most of the developed country in the world, they're all very heavily dominated by service industries. And for many poor countries, developing countries, because labor is cheaper, then they tend to have more manufacturing industries. All right, so let's talk about some other definitions. So know what's a final good and service. So in the definition for GDP, so GDP says we measure all the final good and services, right? So GDP is the dollar value of all final good and services. So to call final, that means this good is ready to be consumed by the end user. So this good is now being sold for the last time. Nobody else is going to buy this and then change for something else anymore. So this good is ready to be consumed now, and that's called a final good. So for on the other end, it's called an intermediate good. So intermediate good is anything that's not finished yet. So for example, let's say we take a bag of flour. Now for a bag of flour, if our household buy it, that's a final good, because you're gonna buy it, go home, make a cake, and you're gonna consume that cake. You're not selling the cake anymore. So this flour, when it's bought by a household, that's a final good. But imagine if a baker buy the flour and then bake a cake out of it and then sell that cake, then that flour will be called intermediate good, because it's not finished yet. It will still be involved in one more process and still be contributing to the final count of the economy. So for GDPs, we only measure all the final good. We don't count all the intermediate good, because we want to avoid double counting. Because if you go back to the baker's flour and cake again, so if you count the flour one time and then you count the cake one more time at the end that's made by the baker, then this flour is actually counted twice now, because the value for the flour is part of the value of the cake at the very last of the production. So to avoid double counting, we only count all the final good. We don't count any of the intermediate good. All right, so a couple more definitions here. So know the GNP. So GNP is stands for gross national product. So this is everything produced domestically, and also everything produced by your home economy. So the difference between your GDP versus GNP. So GDP is everything produced in the country, regardless of who produced it. So let's suppose we say Toyota made a new truck in Texas. Now that truck is made in America, so therefore it's our GDP, because it's made in America regardless of who produced it. Now GNP is who made that truck, regardlessly where it's being produced. So that truck made in Texas by Toyota is US GDP, but it's Japan's GNP, because Toyota is a Japanese company, right? So again, GDP is where the car is produced, GNP is who made the car. And then also know what's the net national product. So that will be your GNP, subtract your depreciation. And depreciation is anytime if you use your equipment, your tools, and they do decrease in value, that decrease in value is called depreciation. Right? So imagine if you buy a new car, and then after a year, your new car, you put 10,000 miles on the car, and that car is worth less value now. So that lower in value is our depreciation. So net national product is your GNP minus your depreciation. And also known as our gross national income. So gross national income, it includes the value of all goods and services produced by the people from a country, whether they're in the country or not. So GNP is very closely related to our GNI, gross national income. Now for America, we don't think too much about the difference between GNI and also our GDP, because for most Americans, we tend to reside in the country. But if you have a situation where the country has a lot of expatriate who are living outside the country, let's say in Mexico. So in Mexico, they do have a lot of workers who are working in America, and their income in America is counted as part of the gross national income, right? So for the example in Mexico, GNI will be very prominent compared to the GDP, because the country's overall income, big part of it is coming from outside the country. For US, it's pretty similar. All right, and I also know what's the difference between a nominal value and a real value. So nominal value, they're anything measured in your current prices, so how much it costs now. And your nominal value is subject to impact from inflation. So whenever you have an inflation going on, then nominal value tend to increase. Now, real value is adjusted for inflation, right? So let me give you an example. Let's suppose we have an employee working for me, and then I would say, hey, my only employee, I will pay you $10 per hour. Now that $10 per hour is a nominal value, because whenever inflation changes, that $10 per hour have different value, right? So imagine we have high inflation, so everything getting more and more expensive, then that $10 per hour is worth less and less now. But instead of I'm saying, hey, employee, I don't pay you $10, but I will pay you 1 order of chicken fried rice for every hour you go for me. Now that chicken fried rice value is adjusted for inflation, because it doesn't matter how much the price is, that employee is getting a chicken fried rice, and that's a real value, right? So nominal value is prone to inflation, real value is adjusted for inflation. And that's why we care more about the real value, because to see the real value, we can really see how good the economy is. And which also brings to another point, that how good the economy is doesn't depend on how much money the country has. So to adjust for inflation, the many economists were looking at something called a real GDP. So real GDP is your GDP adjusted for inflation. All right, so if you look at our nominal value of our GDP has been growing exponentially for the US economy. And if you look at our real value for GDP, it's fairly similar, but there's a difference in inflation. So there's one more measurement. It's called a GDP deflator. So GDP deflator will measure the difference between our nominal GDP and then real GDP, right? So that difference is also a way to measure our inflation, because your nominal GDP will change whenever inflation changes. Real GDP doesn't change, right? So another way to think about it, think that your nominal GDP, I'm going to write this as a N GDP, that's then for nominal GDP, that equals to your price of each year times the quantity of each year, right? So because your GDP matches the total value of everything you produce, so you take all the prices you have times all the quantity you have, that's your total value. But for the real GDP, now I'm going to write this as a RGDP, that's a real GDP. So for the real GDP, we don't have any price change. So for real GDP, your price is fixed. So price wouldn't change. And then times the difference in quantity, right? So that's the difference here. So because for real GDP, if you see a change in real GDP, that means we have more stuff now. We have a bigger quantity. That's good. But if you see a change in real GDP, if you see a change in nominal GDP, then this might be happening because either the price changed, which is inflation, or the quantity changed, right? So the real GDP is it's a more accurate measurement to see how good the economy is. That really shows you just how much stuff you have. So the difference between the two is called a GDP deflator, right? So that's also one way to measure our inflation. So the formula for it, your real GDP will equals to your nominal GDP divided by price index over 100. Now, guys, be very careful. This is by itself, right? So first use your price index divided by 100, and then use the nominal GDP over that. Okay, so you're gonna see a question like this on your quiz, okay, and also on your test as well. All right, so we have example here. So in 1960s, your nominal GDP is 543.3. Real GDP deflator is 19, and I'm looking for how much our real GDP is. So this is the formula. So real GDP equals to nominal GDP 543.3 divided by the deflator 19 over 100, right? So guys, remember, do this part first, right? So do the 19 divided by 100, and then use 543 divided by the whatever the deflator over 100 is. All right, so we talk about this. So our real GDP and nominal GDP tend to move tandem, so they tend to move together. But the difference between the two will show you how much the inflation is. And the difference between the two, again, that's going to be our GDP deflator. Another question you're going to see on your quiz and also on your test will also ask for what is the growth rate. So to find the growth rate of either your nominal or real GDP, you're going to take your new number minus the old number divided by the old number. That's going to be your growth rate, right? So I'm looking for 20. Oh, that's a typo. This one should be 2012, not 2020. Right, so we're looking for the growth rate from 1960 to 2012. That's going to be our 2012 real GDP, so new number minus the old number and divided by the old number, and make sure the number you have is in a percentage, not in a decimal. Okay. All right. So also know what's a recession and depression. So they both means economy going down, but recession is it's less severe, depression is more severe. So if you look at the US economy, we have recession about every 5 to 7 years, but depression, only one depression, 1929 depression. And another way to measure our recession depression rule of thumb, an easy way, is that recession tend to be 2 consecutive quarters. So for 6 months, our real GDP goes down and down, that's called a recession. And depression is defined as 4 consecutive quarters of lower GDP. So depression is a more severe economic downturn. And also for our, if you look at our overall real GDP, so every time it goes up, economy is good. So most times the economy is doing pretty good. But notice this little drop over here. That's a depression. That's 1929 depression. That's a recession right after World War II. That was the 08 recession. And this is the 2020 pandemic recession, right? So every time the real GDP goes down, that's indicating a recession or depression in the economy. All right, and also know what's a business cycle. So business cycle measures the short-term fluctuations in the economy. And for our business cycle here, every time it goes up, that's called an expansion. Anytime it goes down, it's called a recession. At the very top, that's called a peak. At the bottom, it's called a trough. So if you imagining our real GDP goes, up and down and up, right? So this is called a business cycle. So going up, this part of the curve here is called expansion. Going down is called a recession. At the top here is called a peak. At the bottom here is called a trough. So going up and down, up and down, up and down, and that's called a business cycle. And also know what's the exchange rate. We're going to talk more about this in the later chapters. So exchange rate is whenever you're looking at the value of currencies compared to other currencies. So some of the more popular exchange rate that we use in the global economy. So we're looking at the exchange rate between US dollar and the euro. There's a big exchange rate. Also the dollar and Japanese yen, the dollar and Chinese yuan. So all those big major trading partners, the country who are trading, doing import-export, their exchange rate are very important in the global market, because sometimes the economy might doing great, but if your exchange rate changed, that will have a huge impact on your net export and therefore on your overall real GDP. All right, so we have example here. So there will be more examples like this in the later chapter when we go over the exchange rate. So we can use the exchange rate to compare how much is the country's GDP in terms of dollars and compare to US economy, right? So the formula for it, that your exchange rate, you're going to use your foreign currency. So whatever the foreign value is, divided by the US exchange rate, that will give you your US dollar amount. Okay, so you guys can go over this one by yourself, but for this chapter, we don't have any question like this on the quiz, but you need to know this for the later chapters. All right, so last piece of information, looking at what is called a GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is the overall measurement to see really just how good this economy is on individual personal level. So we're taking our GDP divided by the entire population, that's your GDP per capita. So this GDP per capita is also known as a measurement for the standard of living. That every time GDP per capita is increasing, that means the economy has, doing pretty good. And at any time if a GDP per capita is decreasing, that means the economy is doing pretty bad. Okay, so that's our GDP measurement. And also last thing you need to know that GDP is not perfect. There are things that GDP doesn't measure. So for one, GDP does not measure any leisure time. So if you're doing something, let's say play a game or read a book, that's good for you, but that's not contributing to our GDP. So GDP doesn't really show you how happy people are in the country. And that's why if you look at some of the happiest country in the world, so countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they don't have the highest GDP. The highest GDP are countries like your US, Dubai, or UAE, or Qatar. So there's a discrepancy between the highest GDP and also the happiest country. And that's because a lot of things that people do leisure time, that's not contributing to our GDP, and that's not being measured by our GDP. Okay, and also GDP doesn't measure your pollution. So a lot of times when country is having higher standard of living, higher GDP per capita, but they're also giving up in terms of pollution. And also GDP does not measure any black market activities. So something that's illegal does not measure in the economy. GDP does not measure any income inequality. So imagine we have a country with only 2 people. So person A makes $1 million per year, one more zero, and then person B makes 0 per year. Now, what is the average income? Average income is $500,000. That's great, but for this person who's making nothing, that means doesn't mean anything because there's a big income inequality here. So this average of GDP per capita doesn't really tell you how much the income inequality is. Okay, and lastly, it doesn't show you what kind of technology and a product available. Okay, all right, guys, so that's it for this chapter. Have any question, let me know, and I will see you for next chapter. Bye bye.